to get back in the zone.
Shake it out, Cass. I'm Mike Levy. We're here at Pinkbike's annual field test, and the bike we're looking at today is Intense's new trail bike. Now, a few years ago, their trail bike lineup used to include 4 different names, but for 2020, there's one name, it's the Primer, but you could choose from 3 different models. One of them has 29-inch wheels on both ends, the other one has 27.5-inch wheels on both ends, and then there's this model, the Primer S, 29-inch front wheel, 27.5-inch rear wheel. So you can get the Primer S at 2 different price points. It starts at the Expert model, it's $3,900, or this one, this is the fancy model, it weighs 30 pounds, and it goes for $5,800. All right, suspension time. Intense is still using a dual link system, but it is not VPP, and it hasn't been for a few years now. It's called JS Link, and this bike uses their Trail Link system. Now they have a version for cross country and downhill too. The Trail one is tuned towards pedaling, but they say that they also mix some ramp up at the end there from the Enduro bike. It has adjustable geometry via some flip chips here. It says low and lower, and they're not joking about that. 65 degrees in the low setting, or you can drop it all the way down to 64.5. It also has a threaded bottom bracket, and it has ISCG tabs around the bottom bracket shell. You can get a small bottle inside the front triangle on this large. There's also a fair bit of padding on this frame. Down here, we got some thick rubber pads on the back of the seat tube, and then down by the suspension linkage, places where rocks might get thrown up and stuck between the frame and the bits, all the moving components. There is a carbon fiber upper link, which is pretty nice, and it uses blind hardware for the upper pivot. So it's clean on this side, the bolt comes in from the other side. So that's one nice little detail. All right, component spec. Intense has mixed Shimano and SRAM here. They're using XT brakes and X01 drivetrain with a pair of descended carbon cranks. For suspension, it's all Fox. There's a DPX2 on the back. You got that lever, a pedal assist switch. Up front, there's something a bit interesting. Instead of a Grip 2 damper inside a Fox 36, they've gone with a Fit 4 system. So you get adjustable low speed and a 3-position switch for pedaling. So you could firm it up easily. All right, so we tested the Primer S here in Pemberton, where you'll find plenty of steep, tricky climbs and all sorts of rocky downhills, as well as in the Whistler Bike Park that's just down the road. So I'm 5'10", Casimir's 5'11", Intent says that we should be on a large, so that's the size that we're testing. Now, GeoChart says that this bike has a 475mm reach, but that's not quite true. The Primer S is a mixed wheel size bike, so 27.5 in the back. That tips everything rearward a little bit, and it shortens the reach just a touch. We did a quick measurement, and it looks like it's about 465mm, so a bit shorter than what the geometry chart says on their website.
As with all the bikes here at the field test, we use control tires. In this case, they're the Maxxis XL Plus casing with a Minion DHF in the front and a DHR2 in the rear. Tire pressures were 21 and 23 respectively. As far as shock settings go, that Fox 36, we had 72 PSI, and then the rear shock, we had 250 PSI for around 30% sag. If you've been following along, you've probably heard us talk about the benefits of steep seat tube angles. A lot of new bikes have steeper seat angles than they did in the past. With this bike, it doesn't have one. On paper, it's somewhere around 74 degrees because of that smaller rear wheel, and it wasn't noticeable on the climbs. Felt like my weight was too far over the rear axle at times, just felt more stretched out than I wanted to be. I did slam the seat all the way forward in the rails, but still, it just kind of felt off balance, especially compared to the other bikes on test here.
Tell us about that climbing, Casimir.
It's not as good in climbing because the seat angle is like this, and I want it like that.
Yeah, I think I'd have to agree with that as well. It felt especially slack after getting off the pole, which has, it's a 78 point whatever seat tube angle. The Intense just feels, like Casimir said, I feel like I'm over the back wheel, and it's not a long bike, but then it makes the bike feel longer than it is. And it was fine climbing, but it didn't exactly excel in the tricky stuff, that's for sure, relative to other trail bikes here. One thing to keep in mind is you'll need to watch the pedals when you're riding the Primer up some technical single track. Both Casimir and I, we hit him a few times on roots and rocks.
It's worth noting that when we did our tire swap, switching this to those control tires, it ended up with a 2.4 inch wide tire in the rear and a 2.5 inch tire in the front. Originally it's spec'd with a 2.6 up front and 2.8 in the rear, so that decreased the bottom bracket height by a couple millimeters. So even close to the ground, but no matter how you slice it, it's still prone to pedal strikes.
So I rode a lot of twisty trails on this bike, lots of bermed corners, lots of natural corners as well, and it took about half a run for me to realize that this bike corners really freaking well, especially those berm corners. I had some of the best corners that I could remember down Angry Pirate on this bike. It just seemed so at home, and obviously being so low to the ground helps that.
The flip side to that great cornering performance, well, remember those pedals are still close to the ground when you're heading downhill as well. I did a nice trailside scorpion, caught a little stump, the bike went flying, it managed to hit me in the head, and then it went further down the trail. It could have happened on another bike, but I tend to think that having those pedals that much close to the ground makes it a little bit trickier.
I wouldn't say that it felt nervous or anything, and if you look at the geometry chart, you wouldn't think it feels nervous either, but it definitely, I never felt quite as composed as the other bikes in the test, especially the pole when you're going really, really fast.
There's one steep chute in particular that on this bike I didn't feel as comfortable. I dabbed a couple times and kind of had to recompose myself partway down. Where on the optic and the pole, both bikes, I felt more stable there, and looking at the geometry charts, they both have longer wheelbases, and I do think that helps when you're really trying to maintain your speed and get down some pretty tricky stuff.
Those are the kind of numbers, they really give you that you're more sitting between the wheels feeling. You just feel more stable when the bike is longer, and the Intense didn't feel as stable.
The Primer S's suspension is well managed, but it feels like it has exactly 140 millimeters of rear travel. Every once in a while you'll come across a review where someone says, oh, it feels like a bigger bike. It's not the case here. You know you're on a trail bike, and it does its job well, but it also doesn't encourage you just to let off the brakes and smash through everything.
Yeah, I'd agree with that as well. Besides the excellent pedaling, it is quite efficient. Besides that, the suspension, it feels like, I don't know, trail bike suspension. Nothing really stands out. In a lot of ways, that's a good thing. If you don't have anything to say about it, it's doing its job. So for me, the Intense was the slowest of the 4 bikes on our timed trail bike lap. Now that lap had all sorts of stuff in it, a couple burned corners, some rooty rocky things, some slippery things, the kind of stuff you'd see when you're out mountain biking here in BC. It was 1.2% slower than the Optic and the Occam, but it was 6.2% slower than the Big Silver Pole. All right, on to component spec, and I think the standout thing for me, and not in a good way, is the fork. They put a 36 on this bike, which is good. The other models have a 34, but it comes with the Fit 4 damper cartridge. And now there's nothing wrong with that. We all loved it a couple years ago, and it wasn't doing anything wrong. But since then, we have Grip 2, and it works better. I think it would suit this bike, especially because when I think of a mullet wheel bike, I think of a bike that's meant to be ridden hard and fast, and I think you'd want a higher performing fork. That's not the place to skip, really.
Yeah. There's another odd choice here. It's got XT brakes, and they're actually the previous generation brakes. It's the M8020. They're all the way up to M8100 now. There's a 4-piston caliper in the front and a 2-piston caliper in the rear. You see that every once in a while, but I'd rather have my difference in power, if I was looking for a difference in braking power, come from rotor size rather than the actual caliper itself. Just heat management on long downhills, kind of things you might take this bike on. I'd rather have 4-piston brakes front and rear.
All right, I'm a very positive guy, so I'm gonna handle the pros, and the big one for me is cornering. This bike corners so freaking good, Casimir. It is awesome. Better than the other ones, and corners matter the most, I think, so, well, to me anyway, to a lot of other people. The other thing is it's relatively good under power, feels sporty, feels efficient, you don't need to reach down to firm the shock up ever.
The biggest con for me is that seat angle. Just climbing position on this bike, it's super lively and you want to sprint around on it, but if I'm out for a long pedal, I want to be comfortable. I had trouble with the positioning on this bike. There's also those odd spec choices that Fit 4 Fox 36 on it, as well as the brakes, just a little bit out of place. And then the final thing is that it's not a purpose-built mullet bike, basically. So what they did, they took the frame from the 29er, they stuck a smaller rear wheel on it, and they kind of called it good. I think that concept has potential. You can make a bike that handle really well with a bigger front wheel, smaller rear, but in this case, they just kind of skipped some steps and cobbled this together, and I don't think that's the right tactic.
And I think the last thing we want to talk about is tires. It comes with a 2.6 29-inch front tire and a 2.8 27.5-inch rear tire, which is a little bit of an odd combo. I've never been a fan of the big tires, bigger 2.8s to 3.0 plus size things. I mean, the bike is going to work just fine on a set of WT 2.5 Maxxis tires. I
had a lot of fun on the bike, but I think both of us would agree the Geo is not kind of what we're looking for these days. But on the other hand, like I said a million times before, this thing corners so well, it pedals well, that it's going to be a great bike for a lot of people.
Ideal candidate for the Primer S doesn't really immediately come to mind, but it does have some unique characteristics. Somebody that wants a bike that's a little out of the ordinary, but still maintains that kind of classic trail bike feel.
All right, so that's it for the Primer S. Check out the other Pinkbike field test videos, and especially the 3 other trail bike videos and the roundtable discussions where we pick a winner.